Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight, we bring you The Lurking Fear by H.P. Lovecraft, but not as you've read it before. This is a reimagined retelling, crafted to heighten suspense and immerse you in the cosmic horror that lurks beneath Tempest Mountain. The shadow on the chimney. The night was heavy with thunder when I set out for the abandoned mansion that loomed atop Tempest Mountain. I did not go alone. Recklessness had never been my companion. Instead, I brought with me two men of iron strength, comrades seasoned in my grim pursuits, chosen for their uncanny fitness in ventures where horror was certain to be found. We slipped quietly from the village, careful to avoid the prying eyes of reporters who still haunted the place after last month's unspeakable panic, the creeping death that had left the countryside shuddering. Perhaps later their presence might have been useful, but at that hour I wanted no witnesses. How I wish now that I had not carried the burden alone, for the secret I uncovered gnawed at my sanity, and the world itself might have recoiled had it known the truth. Only I have seen what manner of terror brooded upon that desolate mountain. Our motor car carried us through miles of ancient forest until the road gave way to a steep, wooded ascent. The land itself seemed hostile, more sinister than any wilderness I had known. Without the usual throngs of investigators, the silence pressed upon us, and more than once we considered igniting the headlamp, despite the risk of drawing attention. The landscape was diseased with shadows. Lightning-blasted trees twisted into grotesque shapes, vegetation swollen and feverish, and strange mounds rising from the earth like the swollen skulls of giants. No animal stirred. Nature itself had fled, as if it knew death was near. For more than a century, dread had clung to Tempest Mountain like a shadow that refused to lift. I first learned of it through the newspapers, which spoke of a catastrophe so strange that the world could not ignore the place any longer. Tempest Mountain lies in a lonely corner of the Catskills, where Dutch settlers once tried and failed to tame the wilderness. Their departure left behind only crumbling mansions and a scattered population of squatters, eking out a pitiful existence in isolated hamlets. Few outsiders ever dared to visit, and even the state police patrols were rare. Yet among the nearby villages, the fear was ancient, woven into every whispered tale and every basket traded by those ragged mountain folk. At the heart of this terror stood the abandoned Martense mansion, perched high upon the slope that earned its name from the storms that forever battered it. For generations, the stone house had been the subject of grotesque legends, stories of a colossal, creeping death that prowled the summer nights. The squatters spoke in trembling voices of a daemon that snatched travelers from the dark roads, leaving behind only mangled remains or trails of blood leading back to the mansion. Some swore that thunder summoned the creature from its lair. Others whispered that the thunder was its voice. To the outside world, these tales were dismissed as incoherent ramblings, the fevered imaginations of backwoods folk. Yet not a single farmer or villager doubted that the Martense mansion was cursed. Local history itself seemed to demand belief. Grandmothers told of the Martense specter, of the family's strange eyes and twisted lineage, of the murder that had stained their name, and of the unnatural legacy that lingered long after their fall. The terror that drew me to Tempest Mountain was no mere rumor. It was a dreadful confirmation of the mountaineers' darkest legends. One summer night, after a storm of unnatural fury, the countryside erupted in chaos. A stampede of squatters fled their hamlets, shrieking of an unnameable horror that had descended upon them. They had not seen it, but the cries from one doomed village told them all they needed to know. Creeping death had come.
At dawn, citizens and state troopers followed the trembling survivors back to the site. What they found was devastation beyond belief. A lightning strike had split the ground beneath the shanties, swallowing several into the earth, but this destruction was nothing compared to what lay upon it. Of the 75 souls who lived there, not one remained alive. The soil was drenched in blood, littered with fragments of flesh and bone, as if some monstrous jaws and claws had feasted in the night. Yet no trail led away from the carnage. The conclusion was immediate. Some hideous beast had struck. No one dared suggest it was the work of human hands, until it was discovered that 25 villagers were missing entirely. Even then, the numbers defied logic. How could half the population slaughter the other half with such ferocity? The fact remained. On that storm-lashed night, a bolt from the heavens had left behind a village of corpses, mangled and torn as if by a predator beyond imagining. The countryside, already steeped in superstition, wasted no time in linking the horror to the Martense abandoned mansion, though it stood 3 miles away. The troopers scoffed, investigating the house only briefly before dismissing it as deserted. But the villagers were relentless. They scoured the mansion from cellar to attic, dredged ponds and streams, tore through thickets and searched the forests with desperate resolve. Their efforts yielded nothing. The death had come, and it had left behind only silence and ruin.
By the second day, the newspapers had seized upon the mystery, their reporters swarming over Tempest Mountain like vultures. They filled their columns with lurid detail, interviewing ancient grandmothers who whispered of horrors passed down through generations. At first, I skimmed these accounts with indifference, for I am no stranger to tales of terror. But within a week, something in their tone unsettled me. On August 5, 1921, I joined the throng at Lefferts Corners, the nearest village and the searchers' headquarters. 3 weeks later, when the reporters finally dispersed, I was free to begin my own dreadful investigation, armed with the knowledge I had quietly gathered. And so, on a summer night heavy with distant thunder, I abandoned my silent motor car and climbed the mound-strewn slopes of Tempest Mountain with 2 armed companions. Our electric torch cut narrow beams through the gloom, revealing the spectral outline of the mansion rising between ancient oaks. In that morbid solitude, the ruin seemed to breathe menace, its vast box-like walls hinting at terrors daylight could never expose. Yet I pressed forward, driven by a fierce conviction that thunder itself summoned the death demon from its hidden lair. Whether beast of flesh or vaporous plague, I meant to confront it. I had searched the ruin before and knew its layout well. For my vigil, I chose the chamber of Jan Martense, the murdered heir whose legend still haunts the countryside. Something in that room called to me, as if the victim's restless spirit demanded witness. The chamber was 20 feet square, littered with the decayed remnants of furniture. It stood on the southeast corner of the second floor, its walls pierced by 2 gaping windows, one broad and eastward, the other narrow and facing south, both stripped of panes and shutters. Opposite the larger window yawned a massive Dutch fireplace, its tiles depicting the prodigal son in faded scriptural scenes. Across from the smaller window, a bed was built into the wall, its frame long since surrendered to dust. As the thunder rolled through the trees, I set my plan into motion. To the ledge of the great window I secured 3 rope ladders, side by side, each tested to reach the grass below. Then, with my companions, I dragged a massive 4-poster bed from another room and wedged it against the window. We covered it with fir boughs and lay upon it, pistols drawn, 2 resting while the third kept watch. From whichever direction the demon might strike, we had our escape. Ladders if it came from within, the door and stairs if it came from without.
We believed, perhaps foolishly, that even at its worst the creature would not pursue us far. I kept vigil from midnight until 1. Yet despite the sinister ruin, the gaping window and the storm's approach, a strange drowsiness overcame me. George Bennet lay to my left, near the window, already asleep. William Toby sat to my right, near the fireplace, but even he was nodding. I had been staring at that fireplace with unnatural intensity, as if it concealed some secret. The thunder must have seeped into my dreams, for in the brief moments I slept, visions of apocalypse consumed me. Once I stirred, half awake, when Bennet flung an arm across my chest in restless slumber. I could not tell if Toby remained alert, and unease gnawed at me. Never before had the presence of evil pressed so heavily upon my spirit. Then, from the chaos of sleep, I was hurled into waking horror. The night erupted with shrieks, inhuman, soul-rending cries that clawed at the very gates of oblivion. I awoke to madness, to a cacophony that mocked all reason, echoing down endless corridors of terror. There was no light, but I knew Toby was gone. The space at my right was empty, his fate swallowed by the dark. Across my chest still lay the heavy arm of the sleeper at my left. Then came the lightning, an apocalyptic stroke that shook the mountain to its roots. The ancient grove blazed with unnatural brilliance as the oldest of the twisted trees split apart, its ruin echoing like a death knell. In that infernal flash, a fireball tore across the sky, and the sleeper beside me jolted upright. The glare from the window cast his shadow against the chimney, where my eyes had been fixed all night. But what I saw was no human silhouette. It was a blasphemy, a distortion from the abyss itself. An abomination without shape or name, born from the deepest pits of hell. My survival and my sanity remain mysteries I cannot explain, for that shadow was not George Bennet's, nor any mortal's, but something beyond comprehension, beyond description. And then, in an instant, I was alone. The mansion groaned in silence as I shivered and babbled in terror. George and Bennet were gone, vanished without a trace, without even the struggle of departure. They were never seen again.
A passer in the storm. For days after that nightmare in the mansion, I lay in my hotel room at Lefferts Corners, drained and trembling. How I reached the motor car, started it, and slipped unseen back to the village, I cannot clearly recall. My memory is a blur of towering trees thrashing like titans, thunder muttering like demons, and shadows stretching across the mounds like the shades of the underworld. As I brooded over the shadow that had seared itself into my mind, I knew I had glimpsed one of the earth's ultimate horrors, something nameless, a blight from the outer void, a presence whose faint scratching we sometimes sense at the edge of space, mercifully hidden from human sight. I dared not analyze what I had seen. Something had stood between me and the window that night, and though I tried to dismiss the instinct to classify it, the thought returned again and again. If only it had growled or laughed or made some sound, any sound would have been a relief. But it was silent. Silent but heavy as it pressed an arm or a foreleg against my chest, organic or once organic. And yon Martense, whose chamber I had invaded, lay buried in the graveyard nearby. I had to find Bennet and Toby, if they still lived. Why had it taken them and left me for last?
Sleep was suffocating, dreams unbearable. Soon I realized that if I did not share my story, I would collapse entirely. I could not abandon the hunt for the lurking fear. Ignorance seemed worse than truth, however terrible the truth might be. So I resolved to confide in someone, to choose a companion who could help me track the thing that had erased two men and cast its nightmare shadow. Among my acquaintances at Lefferts Corners were the reporters, still lingering to gather the final echoes of the tragedy. From them I chose Arthur Munro, a dark, lean man of 35, whose education and temperament set him apart. He was not bound by ordinary ideas, and I sensed in him a mind willing to face the grotesque without flinching. It was in early September that Arthur Munro heard my tale. From the first moment I saw that he was not only intrigued, but deeply sympathetic. When I had finished, he dissected the horror with sharp intelligence and calm judgment. His advice was practical. We should delay any return to the Martense mansion until we had armed ourselves with deeper knowledge, historical, geographical, and ancestral.
On his initiative, we scoured the countryside for clues about the cursed Martense family. In doing so, we uncovered a man who possessed an ancestral diary, a record that shed startling light on their legacy. We also spoke at length with the ragged mountain folk who had not fled to distant slopes, gathering fragments of legend and terror. Together, we resolved that before confronting the mansion itself, we would first examine every site tied to the tragedies whispered in squatter lore. At first, our survey yielded little, yet when we charted the reports, a grim pattern emerged. The horrors were most frequent near the mansion or in places linked to it by stretches of the grotesquely overgrown forest. There were exceptions, of course. The catastrophe that had seized the world's attention had occurred in a treeless clearing, far from both house and woods. As for the nature of the lurking fear, the shanty dwellers were useless. In one breath they called it a serpent, a giant, a thunder devil, a bat, a vulture, even a walking tree. Their contradictions left us with only one conclusion. Whatever it was, it lived, and it was drawn to electrical storms. Some tales hinted at wings, but its refusal to cross open spaces suggested otherwise. We judged it a creature of the land, though its speed defied belief. To commit all the atrocities laid at its heat, it must have moved with a swiftness beyond anything natural. As we grew familiar with the squatters, we found them strangely endearing in their own way. Crude and isolated though they were, their simplicity carried a kind of innocence. At first they recoiled from us, wary of outsiders, but in time they warmed, helping us clear thickets and tear down the rotting partitions of the mansion in our relentless search for the lurking fear. When we asked them to aid us in finding Bennett and Toby, their sorrow was genuine. They longed to help, yet admitted with trembling voices that our companions had vanished as utterly as their own missing kin. Many of their people had been carried off, erased from existence like the wild animals that once roamed these hills. We were convinced of this, and waited grimly for the next tragedy to strike. By mid-October, frustration gnawed at us. Clear nights had brought no new attacks, and our exhaustive searches of house and countryside yielded nothing. The absence of evidence almost persuaded us that the lurking fear was no creature at all, but some immaterial force. Yet winter was approaching, and all agreed the demon grew quiet in the cold. Desperation drove us to one last daylight survey of the haunted hamlet, a place now abandoned, its squatters scattered by terror.
The doomed hamlet had never borne a name. It crouched in a treeless hollow between two rises, Cone Mountain and Maple Hill. Its crude dwellings clung to the slope of Maple Hill, some little more than dugouts carved into the earth. The settlement lay 2 miles northwest of Tempest Mountain's base, and 3 miles from the oak-ringed mansion. Between hamlet and mansion stretched 2 miles of open plain, broken only by low, serpentine mounds and patches of weeds. From this geography, we concluded that the daemon must have come by way of Cone Mountain, whose southern ridge reached toward Tempest Mountain's western spur. The upheaval of earth we traced to a landslide from Maple Hill, where a lone, splintered tree bore the scar of the thunderbolt that had summoned the fiend. For what felt like the 20th time, Arthur Monroe and I combed every inch of the ruined village. Each search left us more discouraged, yet strangely unsettled by new fears we could not name. It was uncanny even in a land where horror had become commonplace, to find nothing at all after such overwhelming devastation. Beneath the darkening sky, we moved with a grim, directionless zeal, driven by both futility and the desperate need to act. Every cottage was entered again, every hillside dugout examined, every thorn-choked slope scoured for caves or dens. Yet the silence mocked us, and still vague terrors hovered above, as if monstrous griffins crouched unseen on the mountain peaks, their eyes burning with the abyssal light of worlds beyond our own. By late afternoon, the gloom thickened, and thunder rumbled over Tempest Mountain. In such a place, the sound was ominous, though less dreadful than it would have been at night. We prayed the storm would rage long after darkness fell, and with that hope abandoned our fruitless search to seek out squatters who might aid us. Timid though they were, a handful of younger men, emboldened by our presence, agreed to help. But before we could gather them, the heavens split open. A sheet of torrential rain fell with blinding force, and the sky grew so dark it was as if night had descended early. Stumbling through the storm, guided only by lightning and our intimate knowledge of the hamlet, we reached the sturdiest cabin, a crude patchwork of logs and boards, its door and single window facing Maple Hill. We barred the door against the wind and rain, fastening the shutter we knew from earlier searches. Inside, the gloom was suffocating. We sat on broken boxes in the pitch-black, smoking pipes to steady our nerves, occasionally flicking our pocket lamps across the walls. Now and then, lightning flared through the cracks, each flash so vivid it seemed to carve the darkness into fragments of nightmare. The storm's vigil dragged me back to that ghastly night on Tempest Mountain. My thoughts circled the same dreadful question that had haunted me ever since. Why had the demon struck first at the men beside me, leaving me, the one in the middle, for last? Was it chance, or did its unseen tentacles reach with deliberate purpose? Did it know I was the leader, sparing me for some fate more terrible than theirs? As if the heavens themselves conspired to deepen my dread, a thunderbolt shattered the air nearby, followed by the grinding roar of sliding earth. The wind rose in a wolfish howl, a chorus of madness that clawed at the cabin walls. We were certain the lone tree on Maple Hill had been struck again. Monroe rose, pulled down the shutter, and leaned into the storm's fury. Rain and wind screamed through the opening, drowning his words, while he strained to read the chaos outside. Slowly, the tempest began to fade. The unnatural darkness lifted, and a pale sunbeam pierced a knothole behind me. I had hoped the storm would linger into the night, aiding our hunt,
but its retreat dashed that hope. Suggesting we bring in light, I opened the crude door. Outside lay a sodden wasteland, mud, pools of water, and fresh heaps of earth from the landslide. Nothing explained the fascination that held Monroe motionless at the window. Crossing to him, I touched his shoulder. He did not stir. I shook him lightly, almost playfully, and turned him around. In that instant, horror seized me. An ancient, cancerous terror whose roots reached into abysses beyond time. Arthur Monroe was dead. And where his face had been, there was only ruin, chewed, gouged, erased by something unspeakable.
What the red glare meant. On the storm-lashed night of November 8th, 1921, I stood alone in the graveyard of Jan Martense, lantern in hand, its sickly glow casting shadows like corpses across the stones. I dug feverishly, idiotically into the earth of his grave. I had begun in daylight, knowing a thunderstorm was coming, and now that the tempest raged above the choking canopy, I welcomed its fury. My mind was no longer whole. Since August, the shadow in the mansion, the endless strain, and the October horror at the hamlet had gnawed at my sanity. After Monroe's fate, I buried a man whose death no one could explain. Let the world believe he had wandered away. They searched but found nothing. The squatters might have guessed the truth, but I dared not deepen their terror. Something inside me had hardened. The shock at the mansion had twisted my brain, leaving me obsessed with the quest, a quest that had grown monstrous in my imagination, a vow I would pursue alone. The scene itself was enough to unnerve any mortal. Towering primeval trees loomed like pillars of a blasphemous temple, their grotesque shapes muffling thunder and swallowing the wind. Beyond their scarred trunks, lightning revealed the ivy-choked stones of the deserted mansion. Closer still lay the Dutch garden, its paths strangled by pale fungus growths that never knew daylight. And nearest of all, the graveyard. Ward trees clawed at the sky, their roots heaving up broken slabs and drinking poison from the dead beneath. Among the rotting leaves, I could trace the outlines of low, sinister mounds, each one a scar left by the lightning-haunted earth. History had led me here. History was all I had left after every other path ended in mocking Satanism. I had come to believe the lurking fear was no creature of flesh, but a wolf-fanged phantom riding the midnight storm. And in the tangled traditions I had unearthed with Monroe, I found its name. Jan Martense, murdered in 1762. That is why I dug, madly, into his grave.
The Martense mansion rose in 1670, built by Gerrit Martense, a wealthy merchant from New Amsterdam who despised the new British order. Seeking solitude, he chose a remote woodland summit, a place untouched by human feet, where the scenery was wild and strange. It pleased him, save for one flaw. Summer storms struck the hill with unnatural violence, a fury he first dismissed as seasonal chance. But in time he realized the mountain was cursed with thunder, and the storms gnawed at his health. To escape their pandemonium, he carved out a cellar, a refuge from the sky's wrath. Little is known of Gerrit's descendants, save that they were raised in hatred of English civilization and taught to shun those who embraced it. Their lives grew increasingly secluded, their speech heavy, their minds dulled by isolation. Each bore a peculiar mark, mismatched eyes, one blue, the other brown. Over generations, their circle shrank until they intermarried with the servants of the estate. Many degenerated, drifting across the valley to mingle with the mongrel population that would one day become the pitiful squatters. The rest clung stubbornly to the mansion, growing ever more clannish, taciturn, and unnaturally sensitive to the mountain's storms. The outside world learned of them mostly through Jan Martense, restless and unlike his kin.
When news of the Albany Convention reached Tempest Mountain, he joined the colonial army, the first of his line to see beyond the family's walls. 6 years he campaigned, returning in 1760 with broader vision, and for that, his family despised him. His mismatched eyes could not save him from their scorn. The storms that intoxicated the Martenses now depressed him, and he wrote often to a friend in Albany of his desire to leave the ancestral roof forever. In the spring of 1763, Jonathan Gifford of Albany grew uneasy. His friend Jan Martense had fallen silent, and rumors of quarrels at the mansion on Tempest Mountain troubled him deeply. Determined to see Jan himself, Gifford rode into the mountains. His diary records that on September 20th, he reached the estate, finding the mansion decayed and its inhabitants sullen, their mismatched eyes and animal-like features filling him with revulsion. In broken guttural tones, they told him Jan was dead, struck by lightning the autumn before, and buried behind the sunken gardens. They showed him a barren grave, unmarked and neglected. Suspicion gnawed at Gifford. A week later, he returned with spade and mattock and unearthed what he feared, a skull crushed by savage blows. He went back to Albany and accused the Martenses of murder. Though no legal proof was found, the tale spread swiftly, and from that day the Martenses were shunned. Their manor became a place of dread, avoided by all. Yet lights were still seen flickering from the hills, proof that the family lingered. These lights burned until 1810, then grew rare and finally vanished. Around the mansion, legends multiplied. The mountain was whispered to be cursed, haunted by Jan Martense's vengeful ghost. No one dared approach until 1816, when squatters, noticing the lights had ceased, ventured to investigate. They found the house deserted, its walls crumbling, its rooms littered with rotting furniture and abandoned silverware. The clan had departed years before, leaving behind improvised shelters that hinted at their numbers. Their culture had collapsed into ruin. But though the Martenses were gone, the fear remained. The mansion stood empty, yet its reputation grew darker, fed by new tales among the mountain folk. And there it still stood, deserted, feared, and forever bound to the restless spirit of Jan Martense on the night I dug into his grave. I have called my digging idiotic, and so it was, both in purpose and in execution. Jan Martense's coffin was quickly uncovered, but it held nothing now but dust and salt. Still, in my fevered obsession to exhume his ghost, I clawed deeper, irrationally, beneath the place where he had lain. God alone knows what I expected to find. I only knew that I was digging into the grave of a man whose spirit, I believed, stalked the night. At some monstrous depth, my spade and then my feet broke through the earth. The discovery was staggering, a hidden tunnel beneath the grave, proof that my wild theories might not be madness after all. My lantern was snuffed out in the fall, but I fumbled for my pocket lamp, and its weak glow revealed a narrow passage stretching endlessly in both directions. It was wide enough for a man to crawl, and though no sane soul would have entered, I abandoned caution, reason, and even hygiene in my fever to uncover the lurking fear. Choosing the path toward the mansion, I squirmed recklessly forward, flashing the lamp only rarely as I pressed on. What words can capture the horror of a man lost in the bowels of the earth, scraping, gasping, twisting through endless coils of blackness, stripped of time, direction, and purpose? I crawled until life itself seemed a distant memory, until I felt I had become one with the blind creatures of the soil. By chance, my lamp flickered back to life, casting its eerie glow along the loam-packed tunnel that curved ahead. I had been crawling for so long that the battery was nearly spent when the passage suddenly tilted upward. As I raised my eyes, I froze. In the distance gleamed two reflections, two eyes, glowing with a baneful light that stirred half-forgotten nightmares in my mind. I stopped, unable to retreat as the eyes drew closer. Of the thing that bore them, I could see only a claw. But what a claw! Them far above, I heard the crashing roar I knew too well, the thunder of Tempest Mountain whipped into hysterical fury. I realized I had been crawling upward, nearing the surface, and as the muffled thunder rolled, those eyes continued to stare, empty, vicious, and unrelenting. Thank God I did not know the truth then, for had I understood what I faced, I would surely have died of terror. Salvation came in the form of the very thunder that had summoned the creature. After a dreadful pause, a mountain-shattering bolt tore from the heavens, its fury gouging the soil above that cursed pit. The blast blinded and deafened me, shaking the earth with cyclopean rage, yet it did not drive me fully into unconsciousness. In the chaos of sliding earth, I clawed upward, floundering until the rain upon my head steadied me. I realized I had broken through to the surface, emerging on a steep, barren slope on the mountain's southwest side. Lightning flared across the wrecked ground, illuminating the shattered remains of a low hummock that had stretched from the wooded heights above. Yet in the churned soil there was no sign of the tunnel from which I had escaped. My mind was as broken as the earth itself, and when a distant red glare burst across the southern horizon, I scarcely grasped the horror I had endured. 2 days later, the squatters told me what that red glare meant. Their words chilled me more than the claw and eyes in the burrow. In a hamlet 20 miles away, terror erupted when a nameless thing dropped from an overhanging tree into a frail-roofed cabin. It had begun its unspeakable deed, but the squatters, driven mad with fear, set the cabin ablaze before it could flee. And that horror had been at its work at the very moment the earth collapsed upon the creature whose eyes and claw I had seen in the depths.
The horror in the eyes. No sane mind would willingly return to Tempest Mountain, knowing what I knew. Yet I pressed on, driven by a zeal that only deepened as each revelation grew more monstrous. The destruction of 2 embodiments of the fear gave me no comfort. In this abyss of diabolism, safety was an illusion. 2 days after my crawl through that crypt of eyes and claw, I learned that another horror had hovered 20 miles away at the very instant those eyes glared at me. The knowledge convulsed me with terror, yet mingled with a grotesque fascination that was almost pleasurable. It was like the delirium of a nightmare when unseen forces hurl one across the roofs of dead cities toward the abyss, and the only relief is to surrender, shrieking into the vortex. So it was with Tempest Mountain. The discovery of 2 monsters filled me with a mad craving to dig deeper, to claw into the poisoned earth itself and drag forth the death that leered from every inch of soil. I returned at once to Jen Martense's grave, but my efforts were futile. A cave-in had obliterated the passage I once found, and rain had washed so much earth back into the pit that I could not tell how far I had dug before. I journeyed next to the distant hamlet where the death creature had been burned, but found little reward. In the ashes of the cabin lay bones, human bones. The squatters claimed the monster had taken only 1 victim, but I doubted them, for besides a complete human skull, I found another fragment that could only have belonged to a skull as well. No one could describe the creature. Those who glimpsed it called it simply a devil. I examined the tree from which it had dropped, but found no marks, no sign of its passage.
I tried to trace a trail into the forest, but the sight of those colossal trunks and serpent-like roots filled me with revulsion. They twisted with malevolence before sinking into the earth, and I could not bear to look upon them. My next step was to re-examine, with obsessive care, the deserted hamlet where death had struck most savagely, and where Arthur Monroe had glimpsed something he never lived to describe. My earlier searches had been painstaking, but now I carried new knowledge. My crawl through the grave had convinced me that at least one form of the monstrosity was an underground creature. So, on November 14th, I turned my attention to the slopes of Cone Mountain and Maple Hill, overlooking the ruined hamlet, and focused especially on the loose earth of the landslide region.
The afternoon yielded nothing. As dusk fell, I stood upon Maple Hill, gazing down at the hamlet and across the valley to Tempest Mountain. The sunset had been magnificent, and now the nearly full moon bathed the plain, the mountainside, and the scattered mounds in silver light. To any other eye, it was an Arcadian scene of peace. To mine, it was a mockery. I hated the moon for its hypocrisy, the plain for its deceit, the mountain for its festering corruption, and the mounds for their sinister presence. Everything seemed infected, allied with hidden powers too grotesque to name. As I stared at the panorama, my eye caught something strange in the arrangement of the land itself. From the beginning, I had been fascinated by the odd mounds and hummocks scattered across the region. They were numerous near the summit of Tempest Mountain, less so on the plain, as if ancient glaciation had carved its capricious designs more deeply into the heights. But now, under the low moon and its long shadows, I saw a pattern. The mounds were not random. They radiated outward from the summit of Tempest Mountain, irregular yet undeniable, as though the Martense mansion had sprouted visible tentacles of terror across the land. The thought of those tentacles sent a chill through me. I paused, questioning why I had ever assumed these mounds were glacial in origin. The more I studied, the less I believed my own conclusions. Horrible analogies pressed against my mind, images born of my crawl beneath the earth. Before I realized it, I was muttering out loud, half crazed, "My God, molehills! The whole place must be honeycombed. How many? That night at the mansion. Bennett and Toby, taken first, one on each side." In frenzy, I attacked the nearest mound, digging with trembling hands, yet almost jubilant in my madness. And then I shrieked, for my spade struck a tunnel. Another burrow, identical to the one I'd crawled through on that infernal night. What followed was a blur of terror. I remember running across moonlit meadows scarred with mounds, plunging through diseased forests and precipitous hollows, screaming and panting as I bounded toward the Martense mansion. In the cellar, I dug wildly, tearing at the earth in every corner, desperate to find the core of this malignant hive. And then I laughed like a madman when I stumbled upon a passage at the base of the old chimney, where weeds twisted in grotesque shadows under the flicker of my lone candle.
What remained in that hellish labyrinth, waiting for thunder to rouse it, I could not know. 2 creatures had been destroyed. Perhaps that was the end. Yet my obsession burned hotter than ever. I was determined to uncover the innermost secret of the fear, which I now believed to be tangible, material, and alive. I hesitated. Should I explore the passage alone with my pocket lamp, or gather the squatters for aid? My indecision was shattered by a sudden rush of wind that snuffed out the candle, plunging me into blackness. The moonlight vanished from the cracks above, and with it came the ominous rumble of thunder. Alarm seized me, and I retreated to the farthest corner of the cellar, though my eyes never left the opening at the chimney's base. Lightning flickered through the forest outside, its glow piercing the chinks in the wall. Each flash revealed the crumbling bricks and the weeds that writhed like living things. Fear and curiosity consumed me. What would the storm summon this time? Or was there anything left to call? I crouched behind a clump of vegetation, hidden yet watching, waiting for the opening to betray its secret. If heaven is merciful, it will one day erase from my memory the vision I beheld and grant me peace in my final years. Even now I cannot sleep when thunder rolls. I must drug myself to escape the terror. It came without warning, a scurrying, wet-like demon from unimaginable pits, panting and grunting in the dark. Then from the opening beneath the chimney there erupted a flood of life, multitudinous, leprous, obscene. A tide of corruption, seething and bubbling like the slime of serpents, poured forth in a torrent. It streamed from the cellar in every direction, spilling into the midnight forest to scatter fear, madness, and death. There must have been thousands. In the flicker of lightning I saw them thin into separate shapes, dwarfed, deformed, hairy devils, grotesque parodies of apes, silent and hideous. Not a squeal escaped them, save when one straggler turned upon a weaker companion, feeding with practiced ease. Others devoured the remains with slavering relish. And still my morbid curiosity triumphed. As the last of the monstrosities oozed upward alone, I raised my pistol and fired beneath the cover of thunder.
What followed was delirium, visions of shrieking shadows, torrents of red madness, chasing each other through endless corridors of storm-lit sky. I saw forests of monstrous oaks, their serpent roots sucking poison from verminous soil. I saw mounds like tentacles, groping from underground layers of polypus perversion. Lightning flashed over ivy-choked walls and fungal arcades, revealing a world of malignant vegetation and demon architecture. And then, mercifully, I awoke in a village beneath calm stars, led there by instinct alone. Heaven be thanked for that unconscious flight, for it spared me from the abyss. Within a week I had recovered enough strength to summon men from Albany. Armed with dynamite, they obliterated the Martense mansion, shattered the summit of Tempest Mountain, sealed every mound burrow they could find, and felled the grotesquely overnourished trees whose very existence mocked sanity. Afterward I slept a little, but true rest will never come. For I know the nameless secret of the lurking fear, and I cannot believe the extermination complete. What if such horrors exist elsewhere, hidden in the earth's caverns? Even a subway entrance or a village well now fills me with dread. And when thunder rolls, I shudder, begging for a drug that might silence my brain. What I saw in the beam of my flashlight after shooting the last straggler was so simple that I did not at first comprehend it. Then the truth struck, and I reeled into delirium. The creature was nauseating, a whitish, gorilla-like thing, its fur matted, its fangs yellow and sharp. It was the ultimate product of degeneration. A race spawned in isolation, multiplying in darkness, feeding on itself above and below the ground. It was the embodiment of chaos, of fear itself. And as it died, it looked at me. Its eyes, one blue, one brown, were the same mismatched eyes that haunted the Martense legends. In that instant, I understood. The vanished family had not perished. They had devolved, thunder-maddened, into the monstrous brood that plagued Tempest Mountain. The lurking fear was the house of Martense itself.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.